Institute, and we're very glad to welcome people from those institutions here as well. This program on redefining America is brought to us courtesy of the 5 people you see up on the stage and one other author of the survey who could not be with us today. You do have biographies in your program, and we've done that so that we don't have to bore you with long repetitions of the many accomplishments of all the people sitting up here. They are, however, accomplished scholars. Some of you may know that the Woodrow Wilson Center was created by Congress in 1968 to honor the legacy of Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was a major scholar, a major political scientist, before he became President of the United States, and he remains the only President of the United States to have earned a PhD. We bring the 2 parts of his life together, the scholarly part, the political part, by inviting to the center major scholars and policymakers to talk about matters that interest all of us. And of course, what the scholars this morning have brought to us will have an impact on public policy in the United States for some time to come. So I invite you to look at their biographies in your program. The program also has an executive summary of what you will be hearing today and a URL for the video archive of the center. This program is being webcast this morning. The webcast will be put into our archive, and so by mid-December, you can click on the Wilson Center site at the URL that's given to you in your program, and you will be able to get the webcast itself, plus all of the accompanying materials that we will have posted by then. There's also a little list of coming events in that program, and ordering instructions as well for the Task Force Report on Immigration and America's Future, which was put together by Migration Policy Institute, the Woodrow Wilson Center, and the Manhattan Institute, and that this is a task force that was organized and run by Spencer Abraham and Lee Hamilton. As I mentioned, this is being webcast, so you are on candid camera. When it comes time for questions after the presentations, we will be taking questions from the audience here in the auditorium. For those of you who are in the overflow room on the 6th floor, there will be a staff member who will be taking written questions and who will bring them up to the podium. We don't want you to be left out. I'm going to turn the podium over now to Michael Jones-Correa, who we are delighted to welcome back to the center. Michael was a fellow at the center some years ago while this survey was being organized, and he will take the program on from here. So thank you very much, and Michael Jones-Correa.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming here bright and early this morning to join us for the launch, really the first public presentation of this survey, which has been years in the making. The 6 of us started this about 4 years ago. And we're very, very happy to be here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, to have the support of the U.S. Studies Program, the Latin American Studies Program, Roberto Suro and the Pew Hispanic Center, and MPI, the Migration Policy Institute. These are the 6 of us. I just want to point out this is more relaxed times before we realized we were going to be in front of a crowd of 300 answering questions. And Gary Segura at the very end there is I wanted to say, because we've all been partners in this for a very long time, that I wanted to acknowledge his role in this and his role in putting together the materials for today. We received funding from a number of sources, and I again wanted to thank and acknowledge these funders. I won't read them all aloud, but there are a number of them. Aisa Centron from the Russell Sage Foundation is here today. I wanted to thank her for being here. And again, thanks to everyone who made this possible. Why are we here today? Clearly, we were little taken aback by the numbers of people who came here today, but clearly there's a reason why people are here today, and there's a reason why we were very, very interested in putting this project together. The U.S. population of Latinos is growing, and it's been growing rapidly since 1970. Is estimated to be almost a quarter of the U.S. population by 2030, which is, seems shocking, but it's just around the corner. And there are dramatic changes taking place in this population, one by part of immigration, but as you see from this graph, increasingly the growth in the Latino population is going to be a matter of births in the U.S. So the second generation is growing even more rapidly than the first generation. This is a quick breakdown. I'm not going to ask you to absorb it all. Between what the Census Bureau statistics are and the Latino National Survey statistics are, and basically simply to point out that the results that we got with our survey are very, very close to what the census has in its own data collection efforts. About 2/3 of our sample are of Mexican origin. About 2/3 of our sample are foreign-born adults. This is a sample of adult Latino residents in the U.S., both citizen and non-citizen, resident and undocumented, and we have significant samples for at least 7 other countries. So that is the basis of the survey today and what you'll be hearing today. All of this information we're going to run through very, very quickly. We apologize for that. It will all be in form of the actual PowerPoint presentation, the tables, and any background material will be on the website. That will be that's actually in your materials, and that will be posted at the very end. So if you can't catch anything as we rush through this, we have a lot of data to present. Please know that you'll be able to catch up with it later, and of course we'll welcome any questions at the end. Our first speaker will be John Garcia from the University of Arizona.
As you can see from the title of this particular slide, we're going to start this presentation by looking at a concept that's been around for a number of years, which we refer to as pan-ethnicity. That is, we're talking about a population of Spanish origin of approximately 20-some-odd countries of origin, and the assumption is that these populations have more in common or take a character of some kind of community. And so essentially, the separate but related says there are the separate distinctions between persons from Guatemala, El Salvador, Mexico, but there's also relation that cuts across those national origin boundaries. And so is that a reality? We talk about this populations in this more generic pan-ethnic context, but our question is there a reality so that people really identify themselves in pan-ethnic context, in a pan-ethnic terms? Are essentially people still separate? That is, Salvadorans essentially deal within the Salvadoran community or elsewhere, not with other Latinos. Is there a sort of a loose confederation? That is, there is some acknowledgement of that commonality or that bridge? Or in fact, is this sort of a real sense of community, a real sense of togetherness? And so that is really the first question we were going to pose in this presentation. What we see in this next slide is to suggest that in talking about identity, beside pan-ethnic identity, is the presence of multi-census identity. In our survey, we asked persons 3 specific questions. There are a variety of labels to describe yourself, how strongly or not you identify with the following. The 3 choices were American, your own national origin group, and pan-ethnic. As you can see from this table, 2/3 of all the respondents identify with American, higher percentages with pan-ethnic and national origin. So when we talk about identity, our perspective has been is that identity has a multiplicity of identities in America. And in some sense, being Latino is a form of American identity as well as being of Mexican origin as well as being American. So I think this slide tries to suggest that sense of multiplicity. In fact, we'll revisit that particular theme later on, not only in my section, but a couple of other of my colleagues. Is there variation among national origin groups? Unfortunately, with so many different, we took, I think, the 8 or 10 largest groups, and what you can see is that there's pretty much uniformity that all groups have some sense of pan-ethnicity. To somewhat strongly, very strongly refer to your sense of identifying in pan-ethnic or Latino Hispanic terms. The slight variants or departures are the Cubans, which is orange, and the Spaniards, which is red, are slightly lower than the other national origin groups. But you can see overall they're relatively high. The highest groups tend to be Central Americans, Puerto Ricans and Dominicans, who have this sense of pan-ethnic identity. What I try to do is, are there associations with being a pan-ethnic identifier and background characteristics? And this slide presents sort of a summary table of particular background characteristics. One way to summarize that is Latinas, Spanish speakers, and Catholics tend to be stronger pan-ethnic identifiers than their counterparts. Than their counterpart males, counterpart English speakers. But again, these are distinctions. Another one I would point out is, we ask the questions, do you think Latinos constitute a distinct race in America? If you're a stronger pan-ethnic identifier, you're more likely to agree with that particular position or perspective. Again, the summary table, we'll have specific tables that will tell you what the distribution is on these particular items. If we look at it in terms of preferred label, particularly among journalists, I encounter a lot of questions about, what do we call these populations? Are you Hispanic? Are you Latino? Does it make a difference? Our survey results show that the term Hispanic is the preferred term, but not by a significant percentage. 42% of the population says, of the choices, I prefer Hispanic. Concurrently, almost 40% says either one. It doesn't matter. Either term is acceptable to me. So there is it's less of a hang-up, I think, for our respondents about what they should be called. I think the important point here is that they're called in being pan-ethnic is a sense of being rather than a particular label to represent that. The Latino National Political Survey was done 16 years ago. This sense of pan-ethnicity is much higher than it was 16 years ago. So that's an important development that the survey presents. Well, if you're a pan-ethnic identifier, what difference does it make in terms of the political world? Political awareness, political activities, and so we have about 3 slides that sort of try to make some preliminary associations. If you look at this, pan-ethnic identifiers, or stronger pan-ethnic identifiers, tend to be more politically aware, that is, be aware of political news, much more interested in politics, partisan-wise, more likely to be a Democrat, ideologically, you take the converse, they're more likely to be moderate to liberal. So there are some associations by pan-ethnicity identification and some politically relevant characteristics. The second largest category you mentioned, and I think one of my colleagues, Luis, will talk more about partisanship, is that what significant category beside Democrat and Republicans is people who don't know or don't think about partisanship in the terms we do in America. And it's predominantly a foreign-born segment. So that's an important, when we talk about partisanship, that's an important element to bring into bear. What about in terms of political involvement? Stronger pan-ethnic identifiers tend to be more engaged in community activities. They tend to be engaged in activities that involve collective involvement. And if there is a Latino official in their community, they're likely to involve that official in their collective action. So there is a connection between constituency and representation in this result. If we look at it in terms of voting behavior, people who are stronger pan-ethnic identifiers in 2004 more likely to vote for John Kerry than George Bush. We also asked a question of people who are not citizens, who are not voters, their preferred presidential candidate. And we see, again, stronger pan-ethnic identifiers tend to prefer John Kerry over George W. Bush. We had 3 questions about on what basis is it important to make a decision about which candidate you support. What this slide suggests is stronger pan-ethnic identifiers tend to prefer a Latino candidate, tend to prefer a candidate who has Spanish language proficiency or facility, but probably more so in case issues are very important. In a generic sense, 77% of the Latino respondents in our survey says issues are critical in making my decisions about what person I support for political office. And pan-ethnic identifiers are even more characteristic of that sentiment. Finally, in terms of we look at pan-ethnicity suggests some commonality across national origin. We have a battery of questions that talk about intra-group relations, that is, Salvadoran relationship with Mexicans and so forth. We had questions about what we refer to as linked faith, that is, how much is my status affected by the status of others, in this case, other Latinos. What this slide suggests is that people who are pan-ethnic identifiers tend to have a higher sense of linked faith, a higher sense of commonality with other Latinos outside of their own national origin group, both in terms of socioeconomic status issues as well as political issues. So there is some relevance about being a pan-ethnic identifier and political realm. One half of our samples perceive themselves as having commonality with other groups. They're more identifiers are stronger in this sentiment, and again, there is this sense of community So it's not just a label per se, but it's a more active community. I said we revisit the multiple identities. In most cases, you can see the comment on the right says if we force choice people saying, you said you're an American, you said you're Guatemalan, and you said you're Latino, of the three, which is the more salient identification? If our members are put in that situation, this table suggests how it breaks out. And what you can see is Americanness per se, as the label per se, loses out in those forced choice situations. Latino-ness sort of stays constant. That is, you can see that's another departure from earlier surveys. Latino is very much alive and breathing in the United States in 2006. We also suggest that in most cases individuals are not put in these forced choice situations, although much of the public discussion characterizes identity as an either-or proposition. And this suggests that identity is not an either-or proposition in virtually most situations. So in a sense of our original theme about separate but related, we take a position that is less separate and more related in terms of a Latino community. There's clear evidence of a clear pan-ethnic identification. It transcends a lot of background characteristics, especially nativity, which we were somewhat surprised about that. It reflects a number of multiple identities, and there is a real political connection. Being a pan-ethnic identifier does have political relevance in terms of both the political activity and the political life of Latinos. The next slide, or next section, deals with racial identification, because there's a whole concept about are Latinos a racial group, are they ethnic group? My colleague Valerie Martinez-Ebers will make that presentation.
Thank you, John. As John has showed you, we have looked a lot at the extent to which pan-ethnic identity has increased, particularly since the Latino National Political Survey 16 years ago. But another question that we thought was very important is to what extent do Latinos see themselves as a racialized minority group? Obviously, the Census Bureau has had a little bit of trouble accurately measuring the presence, but also the racial identity. So we asked our respondents, let's see if I can get it. We asked them specifically, what is your race? Are you white, black, American Indian, Asian, Native Pacific Islander, or some other race, or more than one? And as you can see, 67.2% said they were some other race, 22.8% white, less than 1% black. And interestingly, only about 2% identified with more than one race. We asked them, however, a second question. And the question was, in the United States, we use a number of categories to describe ourselves racially. Do you feel Latinos, Hispanics make up a distinctive race? Well, fully 51% of the respondents say that they are a distinctive race. So maybe we might let the Census Bureau off the hook a little bit. But is race the same as skin tone? Let's look. Whoops, it's obviously not in order. There it is. They were asked to place themselves on a scale from 1 to 5, where 1 is very dark and 1 is very light. And as you can see by the slide, let's see if I can get my little thing going here, a plurality of the respondents placed themselves exactly in the middle category. Now I'm going to have to go back here for a minute because we're out of order here. Let's see. I am looking for, this is the old slide, y'all. We worked on this forever. Here we go. What's the sorry. They're out of order. I apologize. I want to go back to the question of racial identity and what are the determinants of racial identity. We looked at skin tone, right? Now let's look at the relationship between skin tone and racial identity. Where is that slide, guys? It's completely gone. It's the one we were looking at forever that you all saw. There it is. They're all out of order. Remember that the plurality answer was the middle category. After we take out those that refused, our percentages change a little bit, but we still have we have 43% whose skin tone they said was exactly in the middle. But when you look at the way they racially identify, you see a relationship here, because those who said that they were lighter were more inclined to say they were white. The other race category is that neutral category. So this isn't entirely surprising. What then are the determinants of racial identity? Now, hopefully I can find this slide quickly and I will talk about it. There we go. Skin tone was somewhat related to racial identity, but other things didn't obviously correlate. We looked at their racial identity and their citizenship status. We also looked at their generation in the United States. Michael's going to talk about that a little bit later. But we didn't see any obvious relationship between those who identified with a particular race and their background, citizenship, or generation. There was, however, one obvious difference. This one probably isn't surprising for you. Cuban Americans, those from Cuban origins, are more likely to identify with being white. They were the only ones that were the outliers, and they were basically 25% more likely to identify with being white than the other Latino ethnic groups. But look at the bottom of this slide. Whoops. This is what's interesting to me, because this again represents a significant shift from the Latino National Political Survey 16 years ago. Back then, more than 90% of the Cuban Americans said they were white. It's dropped to 50%. And we have all those Cubans now moving into what they consider that they are another race, another category, which is very interesting. Now, and I've showed you that one. Let's look a little bit closer at skin tone. Interestingly enough, when we looked at those Cubans, their responses with the skin tone were not significantly different from the other racial groups, even though they were more likely to say that they were white. 9% of the Cubans were answering dark or very dark, compared to 10 to 11% of the other groups. What can explain that? Well, it might be some of the experiences also that Latinos have in the United States in terms of their skin tone. We have friends at Harvard who have looked at the relationship between skin tone and how people are treated for African Americans, so we thought we would explore this a little bit with Latinos. And one of the things that we immediately found is that Latinos who say they are a darker skin tone, it is associated with a lot, they're more likely to say they were treated, there's lower outcomes in terms of their income. They make less money. Approximately 20% of those that were the very darkest make less than $15,000 a year, where those in the highest income, 34%, were the very lightest on our skin tone scale. It was the same thing with home ownership. Lighter skin Latinos were more likely to be homeowners. The darker skin Latinos were renters. Interestingly, we did not see these negative relationships, though, when we looked at their employment or their education. Darker skin tone, however, was associated with poorer treatment by society. There were more negative incidents in experiences with police, in obtaining housing, and also their service in restaurants. Finally, one of the things that we explored was how those who how skin tone related to American identity. And this was one that John has talked about a little bit already. And perhaps most of you have seen this slide already because it was up there for a while when we were trying to get the sound going. The most obvious thing, of course, is that the plurality answer for Latinos is that they all very strongly think of themselves as Americans. However, the lightest Latinos are the ones that are most likely to have the strongest American identification. So the relationship between racial identity and skin tone is complex. This is something we need to explore further, and obviously racial identity for Latinos is a very complex phenomenon. So this is something that we're going to be looking into a lot more closely when we have a chance to do some multivariate analysis. Thank you.
Ever since the 2000 presidential election, issues associated with the partisan preferences of Latinos have been the attention of a large number of people, been the basis of a great deal of speculation, and at times the basis of a great deal of misinterpretation. We think that our survey provides us an opportunity to begin to more systematically understand what the patterns of partisanship are for Latinos in the United States, how those patterns vary by region of the country and by state. As you know from the background materials of our survey, our total sample is 8,600. We have state representative samples from 15 states in the D.C. metro area. We also know that a great deal of politics, to refer, as many people do, to Tip O'Neill these days, that all politics is local. We have a capability in the nature of our sampling design to be able to integrate elements of specifics regarding state identity, national origin identity, and so forth. What I want to do with you in the time that I have today is to give you some preliminary information with regards to what we found in our sample about patterns of partisanship among Latinos. One of the first things that one sees from these data is that when, and this statement of partisanship is one where we forced people to indicate a partisan preference. That is, we not only looked at how you were registered. As you know, there's been a sizable increase across the entire country, and Latinos would be part of that increase of refusing to state what their partisan preferences are when they register, or registering as independents. One of the ways to try to get at that survey researchers have been using for a while is simply to ask people, well, who do you tend to lean toward, or who do you feel closer to? What we did in our survey was to ask people, of course, which party do you tend to support most often, which party do you lean to? But for those who said independent, don't know, or don't care, we pushed them a little further. We said, okay, we understand that in general you don't, but if you had to make a choice, which one would you be closer to? The data that I'm presenting to you here are of that aggregation. So they are of people's partisan identification once they are, if you will, prompted to choose. One of the first things that one sees is that there's a 2-to-1 advantage of Democrats over Republicans. This is in our sample overall. That distribution of a 2-to-1 margin, I like sound effects. And when you have 5 people talking to you here, sometimes a little something different might help out. That's why Val and I, in the middle of the presentation, decided we'd have a few sound effects to try to maintain your attention. That pattern of the 2-to-1 margin is maintained for those who are U.S. born. And what we're doing here is separating out the overall patterns of partisan distribution from our sample, from the U.S. born, from those born in Puerto Rico, and for those born outside of the United States. You also see, as the numbers down here in this corner indicate, that for those individuals in our sample who are born outside of the United States, there's a much higher propensity to say don't know or don't care with regards to partisanship. Not a particularly surprising finding, but one for which we now have some systematic information. One of the advantages of the large sample size that we have is that we're able to get respondents from many different Latin American countries of origin. And among the surprising findings that we have in these patterns of partisan identification is that the preference for the Democratic Party holds for all Latino subgroups within our sample, except for Cubans and those who trace their origins to Nicaragua. For all other groups that we have, this either Democrat majority identification or Democrat plurality identification holds. Now, what if we just look at citizens? It's kind of interesting to look at partisanship with regards to the entire sample and groups, but we know that partisanship and partisan identification and potential participation in the political process is especially significant for those who have the formal opportunity at this point to participate, for those who are citizens. One of the interesting patterns that we found is that when you separate out the U.S. born from those who are naturalized, the previously identified 2-to-1 Democratic advantage does not hold. For those who are naturalized American citizens in our survey, these are American citizens, but who are born, oops, there go my notes, who are born in other countries, this Democratic advantage, if you will, is not maintained. It's roughly even between Democrats and Republicans. There are distinct patterns among the naturalized. Not surprisingly as well, those who identify as independents, this is after being prompt to push towards a partisan identification. Those who tend to identify as independents most, the highest percentage is among those who are naturalized as well. And if one separates out the registered from the not registered of U.S. citizens, not surprisingly, one sees there that the patterns are not quite the same as they are for the U.S. born or for those who are registered. There is still the Democratic plurality, but not by the same margins as one sees among the U.S. born or among the registered. And those who say that they don't care or don't know, again, for those who are not registered, are noticeably higher relative to those who are registered. We looked at to see if there were any interesting differences by gender. And of course, we all know that the gender gap at times has become a significant way in which we come to understand the importance of swing voters, especially in particular elections, whether it's soccer moms, security moms, or whatever way is that one might want to understand gender. There's a very interesting argument to be made. What we find with regards to partisan identification is that there aren't very many significant differences identifiable in our sample by gender, although there is a slightly smaller propensity of our female respondents. This is for citizens in the United States, a slightly less propensity to identify as Republican, but far more similarities than there are differences. Now, one of the most interesting things that happened after the 2000 election was speculation exactly about what partisan identification might mean for Latinos with regards to President Bush and the Bush administration. We were able to ask a series of questions trying to further disentangle exactly whether the support that President Bush might receive from Latino voters and have received from Latino voters, to try to understand what the foundations are, if you will, of the nature of that support that has been identified particularly in his 2000 and 2004 presidential elections. What you see here, not surprisingly, is that Republican identifiers who are registered are those who have the highest levels of presidential approving. These are people indicating that they highly approve or somewhat approve of the job that the president is doing as president. There is support even among Democratic identifiers, even distinguishing for U.S. citizens between the registered and the not registered. But what's interesting here is that the strong Republican identifiers, not surprisingly, have higher approval ratings. Now, do those approval ratings also translate into a greater sense of favorability for the president? Another set of questions that we asked, and not surprisingly, and very similar to the patterns that we found with regards to Republicans, there are patterns where those who identify as Republicans have the strongest levels of favorability ratings and the highest favorability ratings for the president. This was strongest among our Latino Republican identifiers in the states of Florida, Nevada, and Texas, and was much less strong, but still favorable, much less strong in other states, beginning to suggest to us that Latino Republican identifiers and the strength of their identification with the president might be distinct depending upon the state one is in. Now, we also asked for those who rated the president favorably, we wanted to begin to try to get a sense of why they viewed the president favorably. And we wanted to test a lot of assumptions about the importance of speaking Spanish, about the commitment to the president's Christian faith, about substantive issues that the administration may take that may be consistent with majorities of Republican identifiers nationwide. And what we did was to ask a question that said, for those who rated the president somewhat favorably or favorably, why do you rate him that way? And tell us how many of these different dimensions are part of your reason for rating the president favorably. What we find here, interestingly, is that his ability to speak Spanish. Now, there are some who would make certain unfavorable jokes about his ability to speak Spanish, and even others that unfortunately would question some of his ability to speak English. But we thought it important enough to try to get a sense as to whether or not his linguistic ability, which in my opinion is better than any other major national politician except for perhaps Bill Richardson and a couple of other folks, to see if that's an important part of why it is that people might assess him favorably. And I was quite surprised to find that it was low. But what one does find that's very interesting, ooh, sorry, that was not supposed to be there. what one does find that is quite interesting is that his policy positions, perceptions of his leadership, and his commitment to his Christian faith and relating well, a vague term, relating well, suggests to us that there is perhaps, and of course we'll disentangle this further, a substantive reason and a substantive foundation for those who rate him favorably, a substantive foundation for their reason. It's not just symbols. Finally, we asked a set of questions with regards to whether or not what our respondents thought was the most important issue facing the country and the most important issue facing Latino communities. For the last set of comments I have for you, I want to tell you what we're able to learn about the identification of the most important issue facing the country and the most important issue facing Latinos when one tries to understand it through a partisan lens, to see whether there are similarities or differences by party, to see what the patterns are across distinct states as well. When asked the question, what do you think is the most important problem facing the country, and similar to the country as we saw in the last election, the issue of Iraq was extremely important. The issue of illegal immigration that received a great deal of attention and was the basis of a lot of speculation when our Latino, these are citizen respondents, when our Latino citizen respondents are asked what the most important issue was facing the country, they followed much more the general national pattern than identifying illegal immigration specifically. What about when one cuts it by partisan identification? These data, looking at the three categories of Democratic identifiers, Republican identifiers, and those who remain to identify as independents, on that same question that we just saw a moment ago, show that the Iraq War across the different groups was the most important issue on their minds during the time when we conducted our survey. The economy continues to be important, and illegal immigration actually drops as the most important issue facing the country. There are some very interesting patterns by state. The extent to which the Iraq War was important was quite different in Arizona, California, Florida, less so in Texas, which was quite interesting and quite surprising relative to some of the responses that we see here nationally and that we see in a number of other states. We also asked the question, not only what's the most important issue, but which political party do you think has the best approach or is likely to have the best approach to address the problem that the respondent has identified. And here I think we have an opportunity to understand in an interesting way the way in which partisanship does and does not affect assessment of overall perceived party capability to address issues in question. Not surprisingly, the Democrats show an overwhelming preference for having more confidence in the ability of the Democratic Party to address the issue that they've identified. It is interesting that our Republican identifiers, of course, the plurality still thinks the Republican Party is likely to do a better job, but the difference among the Republicans between those who think the Republicans will do much better and those who think the Democrats are likely to do much better isn't nearly as significant as among the strong Democratic identifiers. If you will, Democratic identifiers have greater confidence in their own party relative to consistent Republican identifiers. Finally, then, what about the most important issue facing Latinos? These are differences between citizens and non-citizens. And here one notices that the rank ordering, if you will, of issues that are identified as the most important changes significantly. The most important issue that's identified is illegal immigration. When one looks at citizens and non-citizens, there's an interesting limited response that warrants much further examination for non-citizens as to why they might rate education in schools, public schools, as not being a significant issue relative to those who are citizens. But illegal immigration comes out as the most important. Now, what about when we look at it by partisanship? Interestingly, again, illegal immigration across all three bases of partisan identification comes out as the most important issue facing the Latino community during the time that we did our survey. The second most important issue is education and schools. pretty much across, and unemployment and jobs is still there. Interestingly, when one thinks of it from a Latino lens, if you will, the Iraq War that was previously identified as the most important issue facing the country is not personalized, one might argue, with regards to Latinos and their impact on this. What it suggests is that there is issue consistency across partisan identification. Now, it's important to understand we're not suggesting that these partisan identifiers would have the same solution to the particular problem, but in identifying the issue, it was a bit surprising, at least to me, that there was this type of consistency. Then finally, if you look at which party had the best approach to addressing the most important issue of facing Latinos, we see some absolutely fascinating, because we put this together, some absolutely fascinating findings. Not surprisingly, the Democrats again demonstrate that they have a great deal of confidence in the Democratic Party. Just a reminder, this is which political party do you think has a better approach to address the most important issue you think is facing the Latino community today? Democrats say Democrats, not a surprise. Look at those numbers. Absolutely fascinating. Among Republican identifiers, there's roughly an even split in the confidence that they have in their own party relative to the Democratic Party and their ability to perhaps address issues of concern. Republicans are more open-minded, one might argue, at least Latino Republican identifiers, to distinguishing between their partisan identification and understanding the substance of the policy process. It certainly is something that one might want to examine more fully. Democrats are much more consistently and clearly partisans and have more faith, if you will, in their party. There was stronger Republican confidence in Arizona, Florida, Iowa, New Mexico, and Nevada. It was equal to the Democrats in California, Colorado, and Illinois. Among Republican identifiers in New York, interestingly, Texas and Washington, they felt the Democratic Party was going to be better at doing this rather than the Republican Party. So some very interesting state patterns that these national data capture. Thank you.
Good morning. Speaking of state patterns, that's basically going to be the focus of most of my presentation. As we know, if we look at Latinos in the U.S., there are a variety of states that we typically associate as the states where you have the large Latino populations. However, one of the interesting and important developments of the last decade or more has been that the Latino population is now more common or more present in a variety of what we call new areas, or what I will also refer to as emerging areas, emerging regions and states of the country and so on. So that's one very important point to recognize, again, is that moving beyond the states where we have had the largest presence historically, we now see Latinos found more commonly than once was the case, certainly, in places like Arkansas, Georgia, Iowa, and North Carolina. So what I've done is tried to focus on 7 states, 3 that have traditionally had large Latino populations, 4 that have newer populations, and look at some issues in terms of intergroup relations in particular of Latinos and blacks, and to a lesser degree Latinos and whites in those parts of the country. I'm going to focus briefly in the time I have on 3 broad dimensions. One is what I would call commonalities. What kinds of commonalities do Latinos see between themselves and African Americans or Latinos and whites? Secondly, how much competition do they see between themselves and African Americans? And third, how connected or what is the sense of connectedness between Latinos and African Americans? So I'm going to very briefly go through those several points. We have a variety of questions in our survey that deal with these kinds of things, so let me try and summarize them. I did not put these in table form, in part because there are just so many numbers when you have 7 states and a variety of choices, so on and so forth, that I thought it would be better just to try and summarize it in narrative form and then answer any specific questions you might have. And I'll try and give a couple of examples as I go along. The first question we have is kind of a broad socioeconomic kind of question. And as you see, the question is in terms of job opportunities, educational attainment, and so forth. How much do you feel the selected ethnic group, whether they call themselves Latinos, Hispanics, Mexican American, or whatever, have in common with African Americans? Interestingly, in all 7 states, more respondents say that they have some or a lot in common than say nothing or little. So the plurality in all 7 states is on the greater commonality side, if you will. On the other hand, if you look at how this breaks down in terms of the 2 types of states, what I'm calling the emerging or the new states versus those with the more long-term established Latino populations, you find that there's a slight tendency, and it's not real strong most of the time, but there's a slight tendency for that to be somewhat stronger in states like California, Texas, and New York. A second question that we asked then has to do with the matter of having, let's see, questions about commonalities with whites. It's the same question, but again, now the reference group is whites. What you tend to find, interestingly, is that overall there's a greater tendency for Latinos to perceive commonalities with blacks or African Americans than with whites. So this is pretty much the case in general. And there are some interesting outliers. So California is the only state where more say nothing or little in common with whites than say some or a lot. So that's something unique about California. In fact, one of the interesting things that I'll try and mention a couple times is a couple of interesting patterns. But staying on this issue of the general commonality questions, let me just give you some quick numbers, and I think this is notable. Referring back to the question of Latino commonality with African Americans, in the state of New York, and New York is kind of an outlier here in important respects as well. In New York, 57% say that they have some or a lot in common in general with African Americans, whereas 31% say nothing or a little. In the other states, the numbers are closer. But again, here in New York, you see a 26% spread between those saying some or a lot versus nothing or a little. That's the biggest spread of any of the 7 states. If you look at the difference, for example, in terms of Latino perceptions of their commonality with whites, again, you tend to see that it's closer in general. For example, in California, 47% say nothing or a little, 44% say some or a lot. And if you look, again, let me just give one other example in terms of looking at commonality with African Americans and then commonality with whites across states. In referring back to New York, in New York, 57% said, again, that they have some or a lot in common with African Americans. 48% say they have a lot or some or a lot in common with whites. So there's some interesting patterns there that I would point to. Another one that somehow we missed on our slides, but let me mention it in passing. One of our questions has to do with, in terms of your political situation, the political situation for Latinos compared to African Americans, Latinos compared to whites. How much do you feel like you have in common there? You find some interesting patterns where, on the one hand, in Arkansas, for example, 39% say some or a lot, and 46% say nothing or little. So it's about a 7-point spread leaning toward nothing or little. At the other extreme, again, New York, 57% say some or a lot, and 32% say nothing or little, Latino in common with African Americans. When you look at the political situation in common with whites, you tend to find that the gaps are much smaller. So, for example, in New York, 46% say nothing or little in common with whites politically. 43% say some or a lot. So we have some questions about generally in common and then politically in common. So those are some of the so-called commonality questions. Let me turn then to the next set of questions having to do with sense of competition. And here, again, you see what our question is, that some have suggested that Latinos, or whatever term we choose to use, are in competition with African Americans. And we have a series of questions in terms of whether there's competition regarding jobs is our first question. And here, interestingly, the percent that sees strong competition is consistently pretty low, we think. Roughly a quarter see strong, quote, strong competition in getting jobs generally. And this is jobs in general, because in a moment I will refer to public sector jobs more specifically. But in terms of competition for jobs, you tend to find that, again, roughly a quarter. And you tend to find, excuse me, I meant to say a quarter, say strong competition. But what you tend to see overall is that there's not a perception of high competition. at least Latinos in general, do not perceive high competition regarding jobs. Again, New York is a little bit unusual in that regard, in that there Latinos are the most likely to say that of the 7 states, and by a pretty good margin, are the most likely to say that they perceive strong competition with African Americans regarding jobs. In terms of competition to access to education and quality schools, again, what you tend to find is a high percentage saying no competition at all, typically in the high 40s or a majority in some cases, and roughly, again, a quarter do say strong competition. Again, a couple of states do stand out a little bit, and as it turns out, these are states where you have the more long established Latino populations. So New York and Texas, for example, have 35% and 32% respectively. The next question then has to do with getting jobs with city or state government. So again, here we're basically looking at the public sector jobs, and here you find, again, a pretty high percentage saying they don't see a lot of competition. A quarter seeing strong competition. Of the states, that the so-called newer emerging states, Georgia's a little bit interesting in that regard, in that you do see a tendency to say a little bit higher in terms of strong competition about public sector jobs. In terms of the other states, the more established states, there's a general tendency for them to score somewhat higher in terms of saying strong competition. Again, California, 35%. And again, New York stands out, 43%, saying strong competition in terms of public sector jobs. Another question then has to do with competition in political representation. That is, getting Latinos or blacks elected to office, elected to public office is what we're trying to get at here. And again, we see that in the emerging states, what I'm calling the emerging or the newer states, you tend to find that no competition is the most frequent answer. There's not and that's perhaps not surprising. One might not anticipate that at these relatively early stages. And again, remember, some of these so-called newly emerging states may be some where the African-American population has had some success, and maybe Latinos are not politically engaged or integrated enough at this point to be involved in politics all that extensively, at least in some of the states, and that might be part of the explanation for this. Again, Georgia's a little bit unique in this regard among those states, because Georgia says strong competition is the answer given by 36% of the respondents in Georgia. So again, that's a little bit higher than the several other states. Yet again, if you look at the contrast between the newly emerging states versus the more established states, you see that there are differences there. Here you see that the most common answer, the plurality answer in those states, is strong competition. And again, California 38%, Texas 38%, and New York again being the highest. You probably noticed a pattern there regarding New York. All right. The last question I'll refer to is what we call the concept of linked fate. Earlier, the concept of linked fate between Latinos. Do Latinos see themselves as their well-being of some Latino groups being affected by the well-being of other Latino groups? Here the question is the intergroup rather than intergroup question. Here the question is how much does Latinos doing well depend on African Americans doing well? So this is the connectedness question, if you will. I started out with competition, commonality competition, and I'll end here with this notion of connectedness. And again, the percent saying some or a lot in the 4 emerging states is actually pretty high, 58 to 65%. And finally, if you look, and I think this is kind of, at least I interpret this as kind of interesting, is that in New York, 67% say that there is this linked fate. So in New York, you see pretty high perceptions of commonality, pretty high perceptions of competition, and pretty high levels of connectedness as well. And there is a little bit of a pattern across those 7 states to be somewhat similar on those 3 dimensions of commonality, competition, and connectedness. But it's not entirely the case. There are these interesting variations here and there. So one of the things that we will be exploring in our future research, that when we look at this much more systematically, will be, what are the differences across states? Because for all the importance of national politics, the U.S. is, of course, a federal system where the states have a lot of the important political authority around a whole variety of issues, things such as education, the official language initiatives that have been passed in various states and so on. So we really think it's very important to understand what's going on in the states, because the experience of Latinos is going to be different in different states for a whole variety of reasons, including historical patterns, the size of the Latino populations, the size of the African American populations, and the like. So this is kind of a glimpse or a hint, if you will, into some of our initial findings. Let me then now turn it back to Michael, who's going to present issues around transnationalism.
Actually, I'm going to talk about three different areas: immigration policy, transnationalism, and the sense of being American. I want to start off with immigration policy, which ties back to some of the earlier issues which were raised by, particularly by Luis Fraga on partisanship. We all know that immigration has been one of the sort of central debates, certainly for Latinos in the last year. It came up in the questions about what the primary issue for Latinos were, and the survey was taken in 2006. Right. So this is the answer, the black line here, for all our respondents. The plurality for all our respondents is immediate legalization for undocumented aliens here in the U.S. But the interesting distinction here is this is the answer for first-generation immigrants. First-generation immigrants, a majority would like to see immediate legalization. But if you think about who the voters are in the Latino population, many of the voters are going to be in this category, in the second generation and third generations. The plurality of respondents in the second, third, and fourth generation would like to see some kind of guest worker program with some eventual pathway to citizenship, very much like what the Kennedy-McCain bill proposed and what President Bush has supported. So it's important, I think, to distinguish, to disentangle where the majority of Latino public opinion is and where sort of the electoral center of gravity is. And where so politicians are paying attention, they're more likely to pay attention to this group rather than this group. This is a question we asked about the opinion of the Minutemen organizations on the U.S. border and what effect they were having. Again, this is looking at differences in responses across generations. Here, there's very little difference in how the different generations respond to. So the majority here the plurality for most of these groups see more hostility toward Latinos as a result of these Minutemen organizations. But interestingly, and this is important, I think, for the way that voters voted in the 2006 elections, that a very strong minorities for all four generations see the Minutemen organizations as generating greater hostility toward all Latinos. So the immigration issue became an issue not just about immigrants, but an issue about Latinos in the U.S. And again, we see this in the way that the immigration issue plays out across partisanship and across party in the data that Luis presented earlier. And there's very little difference in the way these issues play out across party. The numbers of Latinos who believe that Minutemen improve border control and the numbers who want to seal off the border are a very small minority of Latinos in the response set across generations. So this does not vary across generations significantly. It's not that the second, third, fourth generations are significantly more likely to favor strong anti-immigrant or closing the border policies than those who are more recently arrived, either in the first or second generation. So, I mean, one thing we might be concerned about, and some people are concerned about, is given the recency of the immigration to the United States, given that 2/3 of this adult population are first-generation immigrants, and perhaps as given sort of a response to the increasing anti-immigrant feeling, are Latinos retaining their ties to their home countries, their countries of origin? And the survey suggests that that's not the case. That in fact, if you look at patterns over time, that immigrants very, very quickly begin to, their ties to their countries of origin begin to diminish rather markedly and rather quickly. This is a question about plans to return permanently to country of origin for first-generation Latinos in the U.S. What's very striking here is when immigrants first come, so you have about 43% saying that they plan on returning to their country of origin. But look how quickly that drops off. Within 10 years, it's down about 10%. Within 4 years, it's dropped by half. I mean, it's a very, very rapid drop-off in plans to return to their country of origin. Remittances to country of origin. This is a major topic. Billions of dollars are sent every year by immigrants in the United States to their, mostly their families in their countries of origin. This is a graph of remittances once a month or more, so frequent remittances by first-generation Latinos in the U.S. These remittances are often, average for our survey, were between $150 to $200 a month. And again, you can see upon first arrival, frequent remittances, about 56, 57%, dropping pretty if you sort of drew a straight line, to sort of across time in the U.S., just a very steady decline in the numbers of people sending money back home over time in the U.S. This is a frequency of contact with family and country of origin. So again, very high. This is almost 100% upon first arrival, and declining fairly steadily across time in the U.S. Why does this happen? Well, Latinos, of course, become socialized. They settle in the United States, but also their family increasingly joins them in the United States. So the purpose for maintaining contact, purpose for sending remittances declines over time. Spanish is a primary language of media use. Here the pattern is sort of less stark, but look at this pattern. Upon first arrival to the U.S., 75% or so are only paying attention to Spanish language media. But look how quickly that drops off, and just in the very first few years, and then sort of settles into a more general sort of steady decline across time in the U.S. All of these are sort of signs within the first generation of increasing, we might say, assimilation to the United States. These slides here are for patterns for generations in the U.S. So there's some concerns that the second generation might maintain ties. But again, all of our data seem to indicate that these ties, here we are, contact with friends and family, about 0.8 in the first generation, declines to about 53% in the second generation, declines, of course, markedly in the third and fourth. Remittances in the first generation, slightly under 40%. By the second generation, there's still a significant number, actually, who are still sending remittances back to their families and friends in the countries of origin. But again, there's a marked decline. I've argued before that you can read these patterns one of two ways. One is the decline of transnationalism. The other one is the persistence of transnationalism. That there's in the third and fourth generation, there's still a percentage, about 20% in the second generation, 10% even in the fourth generation, who still have ties to the country of origin and still are remitting, have contact. This is actually quite interesting, and I think the nuances here are something which aren't reflected in the current policy debates. Spanish is a primary language of media use. This is people, again, who are concerned about persistence of Spanish. So even in the first generation, still under half are using Spanish as their primary language of media use. Declines further in the second generation. And of course, by the third generation, this population is almost entirely English dominant. Follow politics in the country of origin. One thing that's striking here is how low that percentage is, even in the first generation. So 15% or so say they follow politics in their country of origin closely. Most people, when they come to the United States, well, the plurality, or majority, I think, are not interested in politics at all. They're not following politics very closely at all. But they're outnumbered by the people who are following politics in the United States. And of course, this drops fairly markedly across generations. Again, you can read this one of two ways, that even in the second generation, third generation, there's a small, under 10% minority who are still interested in country of origin politics. So what does this mean for being American? We've seen some of this data before on identification with being American. The difference here is that we're looking at identification patterns across generation. So again, if you look at everything concerned about assimilation or interested in assimilation issues, here's the people who, in a forced choice, identify as American. You can see very rapid increases across the second and third generation, where strong majorities say that they feel American. It's interesting that the Latino pan-ethnic identifiers increase in the second generation, but then begin to drop off. They're sort of overshadowed by the identification with being American, and country of origin identifiers drop over generation. So again, I'm sorry, this is the primary identifier, so this is the forced choice. American increasing, country of origin identification decreasing, Latino identification sort of higher, but being eventually overshadowed by the identification as American. So what does it mean to be American? We ask these questions about the perceived importance of, say, speaking English for this notion of being American. Interesting thing here is that very, very high percentages, again, even in the first generation, say that speaking English is essential to being considered American. This drops a little bit over time through the second and third generations, fourth generations. One might argue that this is actually the drop you would expect to drop because this is actually, if you think about what it means to be American, the way we're taught is that American is a set of understanding of a set of principles, not about a set of characteristics. So one thing that's very striking to us here, and as you'll see in all these slides, is that in fact people attribute content to being American that goes beyond simply a set of principles. Speaking English is the strongest. Here's a question about perceived importance of being white to being American, where the majority here say not important, and that increases over generation. But what's really kind of striking is how many people think that being white is either somewhat or very important to the notion of being American. So if you add these two together, about 30% of respondents across generations think that being white is somehow an important attribute of being American. Importance of being Christian. This is, in fact, even higher. So again, not important increases over generations, which is what you'd expect and what you'd hope. Percentages of being very important, over 40% for the first generation, sort of bumps up and down between 30 and 35% for the succeeding generations. So you could say if you add these two lines together, the majority of respondents think that being Christian is either somewhat or very important. That's a quite striking finding. It is not that dissimilar, actually, if you ask similar kinds of questions for native-born whites in the U.S., they also feel that being Christian is very important. But it makes you wonder, so people feel that they are becoming American, but what are they learning about being American? They're learning, in fact, that American has these contents to them which go well beyond our notion of respect for the Constitution. Oops. That's not the... That shouldn't be the end. Well,
it's a different program. Wing the last slide.
Yes. Pretend there's a slide.
Tell us about it.
We'll hum in the background.
we've talked about language, we've talked about religion, we've talked about race. I'm trying to think those are the main. There's supposed to be one more slide up there, which is our concluding slide, which is simply to say that we have websites, which we were going to point you to, which now we can't point you to.
They are in your executive summary.
Yes. And I wanted to say again that obviously from the presentations today that this is very much you can see a communal project, a group project, and all of us here have been working on this very hard. Again, I wanted to thank our sponsors and thank Cesar Melgoza, who's here from Geoscape, and ISA. Cesar and his firm drew up the sample from which the survey is based. ISA actually conducted the survey, and we wanted very much to say that no project like this can be done by well, God forbid, by any one person, and that this really is and has been a joint effort. At this point, we want to turn this over to questions. I'll be moderating the questions, but all of us will be answering the questions. So you feel free to direct the questions to any one of us or to all of us. We will also be taking questions from those of you who, I apologize, are sitting in the overflow rooms, and those of you who are there will be submitting questions in writing, and we'll be answering them here from the podium. So, questions? Yes. Yes, please. Oh, so you'll have a...
Yeah, I'm Greg Squires. I'm chair of the sociology department at George Washington University. And I'm curious as to what you think is going on in the minds of somebody who identifies as a Republican or a Democrat, but believes that the other party can not only handle the country's problems better, but can handle their own problems better. And what are the political implications for both Republican and Democratic parties for trying to recruit these voters?
Well, I think I was surprised. I won't speak for my colleagues, but I was surprised at the way in which there may be, in fact, two distinct dimensions to partisan identification, at least for Latino Republican identifiers. They may, in fact, have a set of reasons, shall we say, and this obviously is something we need to explore far more systematically than we've done so far, may have a strong and consistent and in part policy-based set of reasons for preferring the Republican Party and preferring to identify with the Republican Party. But they're able to distinguish their individual reasons with understandings more broadly about which political party, at least in 2006, which political party, their own or the opposing political party, may have the best ideas as to how it is to address what they have identified as the most significant issue. Perhaps I don't even need to say it, but the extent to which the Iraq War was identified as an important issue, the most important issue facing the country, it's not too hard to speculate as perhaps, according to much of our public opinion data, many Americans, whatever their partisan identification, identified the need for a change. And to the extent that this presidential administration is linked to a particular set of policy decisions regarding Iraq, then we'd go down that way. Interestingly, when you think of the issue facing Latinos and illegal immigration, there's a noticeable split within the Republican Party, right? You have the president, John McCain, Sam Brownback, Lindsey Graham, right, who took Chuck Hagel, Mel Martinez, important Republican senators who took positions quite distinct from what the majority set of preferences in the House of Representatives. So is that part of what's being captured here? We'll have some opportunity to get some leverage on there. What it does suggest is that perhaps the current state of Republican partisan identifiers among Latinos may be less consistent and less, if you will, deep in the way in which that may translate into a cross-generational cohort effect in terms of the identification over time.
Sort of a clash between long-term, deeply held values versus a short-term sense of somebody's competence.
Yeah, it's possible.
Also, our
be.
survey suggested we had a question about the strength of partisan identification. And not strong versus strong, and not strong among Republicans was higher than the strong Republicans. So it's also attachment to the party. I think if you look at also issues, even though, for instance, Cubans have been most closely associated with the Republican Party, but in terms of social issues, Cuban populations, these public surveys suggest that they're more liberal than their non-Cuban, non-Latino Republican counterparts. So there's some ideological and issue variations within Republican affiliation.
Yes.
I have a question and a comment. Maurice Ferre from Miami. The question is, did you send a copy of this to Sam P. Huntington?
We will.
Okay. And the comment is that I think Karl Rove, and I'm a Democrat, but I think Karl Rove is evidently a pretty smart fellow, because I think he's figured all this out. And I think the way they targeted Central Florida for the Hispanic vote is very indicative of a keen understanding of where they can pick up some votes and how to, and the process of going about doing it. And I think it's very pertinent for 2008. In other words, it worked in 2000, 2004 with Jeb Bush, 2006. But I think it's what you've scientifically proven, I think, is clearly indicated as a pattern that the Republican Party has picked up, and I think mainly through Karl Rove. And the Christian issue, I think, is also very indicative of that, where they can penetrate, and you can see that in at least I see it in Florida in the evangelical churches, where they're really concentrating in that area.
Right. I'm going to take just one of the questions from the overflow rooms. There's a question here about return to the home country, asking how many Latinos return to their home country, and that the percentage of returns would, of course, have an impact on the figures here. The U.S. actually keeps data on people who come into the country and very poor data on people who leave the country. But it is interesting that one of the unintended side effects of sealing off the border has been to shut off this cyclical migration that has been the historical pattern in the United States between Mexico and the United States. And that, in fact, one of the reasons why you might see such a sharp decline in the numbers of people who decide, sharp increase in the number of people who decide they're staying in the United States is that once people arrive to the U.S., they find that going back to their countries of origin and perhaps returning back to the U.S. is very, very difficult. So we've essentially shut off this cyclical migration policy, pattern as a result of our policies. Yes, back there.
Right to your right, your left.
Thank you. I'm Per Korowski. I used to be executive director of the World Bank for Central America, Mexico, and as well as Spain. And so I'll look at the results here from a little different angle, not the politics angle, internal politics, but more about the concerns from the countries of the immigrants, because we have spent a lot of time discussing and debating the threat of issues like brain drain. But from some of these charts, it was absolutely clear that the most fundamental threat for many of these countries is more the heart drain, because they really are sort of very fast forgetting their homeland. And I would really want some comments from you on that issue, because that has been forgotten. That has tremendous implications for just 20, 25, 30 years down the line that are not being really considered in the planning of the future. Thank you.
I can respond partially. I mean, some of the work that Michael's done and some of the things I've done also reflects questions that how home countries have tried to maintain and essentially support that connection. Dual citizenship has been one response by a number of Latin American countries to allow for dual citizenship, and some of those have been partly a function of the expatriates in the United States pushing their countries to allow that to be the case. Also, there's been cases where the home country has established formal agencies or bodies to recognize that community. So there is some conscious effort by the countries of origin to maintain, perpetuate, in some cases prevent access that what otherwise might be more difficult. So, I mean, in some sense, that response goes both ways. And the country of origins have tried to maintain and see the utility from a remittance point of view. I think for some Central American countries, remittances constitute, what, 10, 15, 20% of the gross domestic product. So it's an important both patriotic connection but also an economic connection, and I think these countries of origin are going to do their best to try to maintain that to go on for a longer period of time than what our slides suggest.
Just to add on to that, I think that much of the recent conversations that I've seen from the Inter-American Development Bank and the World Bank and the sending countries to try and build a development policy around remittances, I think is likely to be a mistake. That these remittances are declining over time and decline fairly quickly, and so they cannot be the engine for development over the longer run. Yes. Sorry.
Can I invite you to speculate about the reasons for the increase in pan-ethnic identification that you see over time, and also about the extent to which it might form a basis for political mobilization?
Both our data suggest, as you indicated, or we indicated, that the time period from the National Latino Political Survey and this one shows a much heavier pan-ethnic awareness and identification. In fact, one thing that sort of reinforces that findings was we had conducted a series of focus groups, I think in 14 sites, probing questions of identification. And we had both focus groups in Spanish as well as in English. And consistently, when people identify themselves or use descriptors, identify themselves more in Latino, Hispanic context than their country of origins. If you look at their networks, and we have questions about the composition of their social networks, those social networks transcend national origin boundaries. Their co-workers or their neighbors are Brazilian, and there's a lot of interaction in terms of intermarriage. My sister goes with an African-American boyfriend, or my cousin is married to a Brazilian, and that person may be Mexican. So there's a lot more interaction taking place. Although, ironically, one other kind of, I think, issues of complexity is that the percentage of Mexican origin persons under that Latino umbrella has increased. In fact, some cities, I think, like Chicago, has in some ways re-Mexicanized. Chicago is more of a inter-Latino mix, but the percentage of Mexicans in Chicago metropolitan areas increased. And so, but I think there is a greater globalization awareness that I may be Mexican and my primary connection may be Mexican, but there's a awareness and an interaction that cuts across those national origins. The last thing I would mention is that what you clearly hit on is if that exists to the extent that we're suggesting it does, what it does, it obviously creates a significant political opportunity for mobilization. And what we generally know about mobilization is that that generally requires both organizational and leadership catalysts to take this sort of sense of ethnicity and direct it into a political kind of context. And so in some sense, the burden then falls on that activist Latino element to capture and utilize that sense of pan-ethnicity for political purposes.
I would just very quickly add that it's important to distinguish between patterns of identification and substantive bases for the development of political coalitions. One of the interesting tables that we have that's available on the website of the weighted tables, it's not in, I believe, the handout you picked up here, but it's ones that are there now giving some raw information, is that if you look at it from a statewide level, there is still a pattern where most Latinos live with co-national origin folks. There are some differences, New Jersey, Florida, New York, but if you look at the states that we sampled in, most of them are still overwhelmingly Mexican origin. So maybe these possibilities are greater in certain states where you get that sort of mixture, but you could still get among Latinos in a state where Mexicans are clearly the largest group, still get some greater sense of themselves in using a term that would be a pan-ethnic term. And part of what we want to do is to try to disentangle that. And we think we've got, because of our state-based data, some analytical leverage in being able to disentangle that in a more systematic way than perhaps has been able to be done before.
Just augment that, one other feature of this project, which we're less sort of prepared to talk extensively about, is that in addition to the individual responses that we have about our 8,634 respondents, we have a number of what we refer to contextual data that was generated by Geoscape that talks about the context in which these individuals live, both demographically, politically. We have contextual data that tells you, is there a Latino elected official in that given area or not? What's the composition, diversity among Latinos or non-Latinos? What's the economic level? So that's another layer that we're going to add to our analysis to look at what conditions may be conducive for greater or lesser mobilization.
The young lady
had a question.
I'm sorry. Yes.
Thank you. This is a little bit. Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, this is a question that was sent to me that somebody who's not in this room sent, and it's Marie Price from George Washington University. Her question is, when exploring the question of race competition in linked fate, was any consideration given to Asian populations and their interaction with Latinos? If not, why not? We did, in fact, ask a question about Latino relationships with Asians. We didn't ask it in all the states. I know we asked it in California, certainly, in Illinois, I believe, in
Texas.
New York.
Texas.
There were certainly not all of our 15 or 16 areas, but we did ask essentially the same questions that we saw up here with respect to African Americans and whites. The reason we didn't discuss it here today simply is because we felt like we had so much to address, and we just didn't think we could fit it in. So I hope that answers that question adequately.
Okay.
Thank you. I wanted to ask Mr. Garcia, it seems like your presentation, if I saw it correctly, that a greater percentage identified themselves as the Latino, Hispanic than American, a larger percentage. Is that because of recent arrivals that have just gotten here and aren't quite?
Well, it seems it cuts across. I mean, the degree of pan-ethnic identification seems to be even as pervasive among the first generation. Or we didn't look specific. I didn't look specifically in context about the length of time they've been in the United States, but look at nativity. The pan-ethnic identification seems to be as prevalent among foreign-born first generation as among native-born. That was the surprising part for us, because it seems to be that the pervasiveness of pan-ethnicity is pretty much evident across that dimension.
Some people might say, I covered the immigration debate, so I'm anticipating this response from some groups, that this shows that people are not Americanizing, that they feel like they're Latinos more than they feel like they're Americans. I want to get your response to that.
Well, that's the thing we have argued, that the whole multiplicity of identities, that essentially being Latino is an American identity, because in many contexts, people do identify themselves as Latinos outside of the U.S., and so essentially it gets again about part of that debate gets into an either-or type of context. And what we're suggesting is the reality, and not necessarily for Latinos exclusively, is that people have a multiplicity of identities. And essentially this reinforces that's the reality not only for Latinos, but probably for other non-Latinos. And to frame the debate as an either-or serves more to limit discussion and not characterize people's realities. I think that's, and again, other people may make some additional comments.
All right. The gentleman in the back.
Thank you very much. Great presentation. William Ramos, Naleo Educational Fund, Washington, D.C. offices. I was amused by one of your slides that you sent out, the miracle of sample size and the more miracles of sample size, how the U.S. Census and the Latino National Survey numbers pretty much fell in line. In the issue of racial identification and forced choices, was there ever any consideration given to the fact or considered that a lot of Latinos don't identify themselves either as white or black or Hispanic, but we're having a great number of folks identifying themselves in the indigenous categories of Central and South America? And I ask this as the U.S. Census is grappling with this particular question right now, because in the 2000 census we saw a whole host of numbers of Latinos not being counted. 1 million Dominicans were lost in the census, and we know that in New York City alone, Dominicans surpassed the Puerto Rican population. What was the questionnaire, or how did it go into the indigenous aspect of?
I can respond to that, because we're in a. For persons who answered some other race in that particular question, we asked them what that some other race was.
And our question wasn't designed to force a choice. They were allowed to say as many of them as they wanted to. And then when they did say some other, we asked for what that was. And we are, as John said,
and I can give you some preliminary, because I've been involved with the actual coding of those open-ended responses. The major responses tend to be four different categories. One is, a lot of people said Latino or some variant of that, Latino, Latina, Latin American. Another segment said Hispanic or some variant of that, Hispanic, Hispano, Hispana. And that represents, I think, there's about 5,800 persons who gave some other race response. And so we're going individually by case and looking at those responses and put them into categories. The indigenous is another one. Some mention specific indigenous populations, not only in Mexico but in Central America. Others made specific responses, I'm indígena or indigenous. That, I suspect, in terms of the end, my recollection is that probably about 100 or so persons said that. The other common response was a national origin response. That is, I'm Mexicano, I'm Guatemalteco. That is, they gave a specific national origin. So what we're doing is that we're recoding, and in fact, we're going to create additional specifications of what some of the race means. Now, there are other people who, we follow the census rule of thumb in recoding, who says, I'm a white Hispanic, or I'm a black Hispanic. And as you know from the census, if the question is race, then the white responses fall into the race white category. So we're recoding some of those persons who gave a ethnic and racial response into the corresponding racial response.
But the percentages I showed you today were not those. We are still working on those open-ended, right? We haven't already moved those.
No, we've now
so
gone.
These are people who just responded straight.
Now gone on. We've actually gone through all those responses and created about 6 different categories, and we haven't folded them into the data set yet, but that's what we've come up with so far in terms of types of responses. Because the other thing in terms of some other races the Bureau and the people from the Bureau here can talk about is that some other race, the whole concept of race is problematic because it means so many different things to different people.
That's right.
And so when you say some other race, it's not uncommon on the actual form. The person may check off not only some other race, but indicate some other in the other category for Asian, or the other category for Native American, repeat the same response because saying, I don't see myself there, and I'm going to let you know that's the case.
Okay.
Vis-a-vis the change of Cuban Americans in Miami in the identification of race from the last survey to this one, would that be a consideration to include as an official category or box in the questionnaire instead of just a self-identifier for future surveys?
That's a tough one because obviously I know that debate's been going on with the Bureau for a number of years because obviously what the Bureau faced in 2000 was that the sum of the race as a category, and however you define it, was the fact the third largest racial group in America. And the question is, but is this some other race? Is it a category? And I think the other issue that's gone on in terms of a policy implication has been if in fact your option is either to fold in the race ethnic question in the Census Bureau, so you have one question rather than 2 separate ones. There have been some studies in the 2000 survey. If you do that, it makes some real differences in how people respond to it, and particularly if you're trying to quote, at least studies that I'm aware of, maximize the number of Latinos, Hispanics in through the census. It's affected by merging them, and in fact, it lessens that, and it has, at least in 1998, a number of Cubans, if depending on how the question is framed, move out of that, will not go to Hispanic, but will go to white. And so there's a lot of policy implications with more than the data thing, but I think part of what feeds it is a conceptual issue. Race is just a tough concept, and as long as we rely on self-identification, we're going to get a real mixed bag of lots of different things.
Okay. Two things. One, we've got notice that the survey, the top lines, the demographic tables, the presentation you saw today are now all on the Woodrow Wilson Center's website, which is on the packet that you received. So all of this information is on there. You can all check on that and email us with more questions. Second, we have a lot of questions, and I want to turn one more from the audience who's trapped in those back rooms to Luis Fraga.
Someone asked this question, how would you explain that while Hispanics are a majority Democrat, identified by majority with the Democratic Party, or plurality, at least substantial plurality, they many times identify with socially conservative issues? Is there a disconnect with party affiliation and values? There is some research that's looked at this, and certainly our data set will lend itself to even more careful research along those lines. I would think of it as, the way I would explain it is to think of it in terms of 2 distinct dimensions. There's partisan identification and issue positions. We ask a whole set of questions regarding the traditional issue positions on abortion, on the war, on gay marriage, on a variety of the hot topic social issues of the moment. People can express preferences by majority on those issues, yet have a distinct set of criteria that they may use for determining which party they feel closest to, and yet a third set of criteria they might choose as to who to vote for. And so one shouldn't necessarily, it's an empirical question as to how much these align, for whom do they align, under what circumstances does one get an alignment across these distinct dimensions. I think too often in our national discourse, and there's some reasons for it, too often in our national discourse, the immediate leap is made that the pattern of preferences on issues leads to a predisposition or potential to identify with one political party or another. And I think we've known, at least for Latinos, and certainly in American politics generally for a number of years, that those can be distinct thought processes, and the context within which those judgments are made can be distinct, especially by specific elections and specific candidates. One of the things we'll be able to do is to have, I think, one of the richest understandings, consistent with some other data that the Pew Hispanic Center has put together, as to exactly what the nature is, the substantive nature is of strong Democratic identifiers, strong Republican identifiers, and see what similarities and differences are for them.
Could I add something just very quickly? And here I'd like to invoke Gary Segura, our colleague who cannot be here today. But Gary Segura has done some work on this question, and basically the answer he gives is very similar to what Luis just presented, but a little slightly different, I think. His research suggests that you can look at a whole variety of issues, and Latinos may take what are perceived to be conservative positions on some of these, quote, social issues. But then if you look at other, what you might call socioeconomic or social well-being kinds of issues, and they take more, quote, liberal positions on that. The question then becomes, which of those two are more important in terms of how they ultimately decide their votes or their party identification? And it seems to have been the case most of the time over some extended period of time that Latinos have, in a sense, tilted, if you will, or placed more significance on the socioeconomic kinds of issues. That's part of the reason, I think, why we know why the Republican Party would like to frame policy debates more around social issues and make them more prominent, because that obviously or presumably plays to their strengths and their perceptions of the Latino orientations. Democrats would be more likely to emphasize the socioeconomic kinds of questions. So that's how I think we partly explain that, quote, disconnect.
The gentleman in the back.
Thank you very much. Joe Honey Gonzalez with Montgomery County Government in Maryland. On your examination of commonalities, competition, and connectedness, you gave information about the Latino perception with regard to competition, strong or not as strong. Were there factors on the reverse side, like the African Americans feeling competition towards Latinos or Asian or other ethnic groups, specifically in the area of jobs and education?
See, our survey is only of Latinos, so we don't. So we didn't survey Asians or others. Now, having said that, there are data out there on these kinds of questions, and to the extent we can get access to that, and that it kind of compares in terms of the wording of the questions and the context and so on, I anticipate that we would look at it. But again, remember, this is an entirely a Latino survey, so it's all through the eyes of Latinos and their perceptions of commonality and so on.
I just want to end by saying thank you very much for all of your work. This is a tremendous contribution for a lot of the work that's being done, both in the public and the private sector.
Gentleman there.
Yes, I just wondered if you were able to get you have any thoughts on whether the focus of immigration legislation has had any impact on the remittance volume between the Latinos or Hispanics, and any in their patterns or their vehicle of sending money, either using the money transfer organizations or informal markets.
That's a great question, and the short answer is no. We don't. We haven't. We possibly can look at part of that question. We don't ask questions about the means of transfer, but we can probably get something. We might be able to get something at the rate of transfer. Yeah.
Well, the other thing, just real quick, I mean, the interest for that aspect, the economic aspect of remittances, the Federal Reserve Banks, I think of Boston and Chicago, have done studies about remittance levels, but also the banking industry itself sees a market niche in terms of electronic transfer of remittances to country of origin to facilitate that, open up accounts for persons who may not have legal status. So there is the private sector interest in that aspect of it, which obviously our survey doesn't deal with directly.
Yes. The gentleman over there on against the wall.
Good morning. My name is Juan Carlos Ruiz. I was the coordinator for all the rallies that happened in April 10. And I also work with the Senator Jim Webb campaign and coordinating the Latino vote in Virginia. I want to acknowledge the presence, the State Representative Ana Sol Gutierrez from Maryland. I want to give her a round of applause, a leader in this area. She works very hard with the Latino community. I want to emphasize with Joe Haney says the work that you guys do help us, the work that we do on the ground. The messages, the researches, they are coming out. It's helping us to bring up the issues the Latinos are working with. So have said that, I also want to say the languages that you use to come out with the resources that you come out is, I'm very glad to hear how careful you drafted your language, because it can be very picked up right now and used against us. So thank you for that.
Let me just make one response relative to the marches.
Yeah.
We were in the field for almost 9 months. And the marches took place in March, April, and so forth. Yeah. And so we now are we're doing something from an analytical point of view, which we didn't plan to do, is that we have data on when marches took place, where they took place, number of participants. And so what we're going to try to see is, if you're interviewed after the marches took place, are your responses different than those who were interviewed prior to that? Now, we haven't done any of that, but we're building that into our an analytical plan and data collection.
Yeah, I thank you. That was one part of my question, because that's what I saw in Virginia, how that had an impact and the messages that we used to get people out to vote and change a lot of dynamics between religion and faith and all that kind of stuff. But the question I was coming to is, from all the information we have got, there is maybe some speculation that you might have is, where do you see the commonalities that the Latino issues are with other races? I think you touched a little bit on that, but I don't know, you can profound in that, like minimum wage. Besides the Iraq war, maybe healthcare for all, is that any issues that you have found in there?
There's some issues. For instance, immigration seems, as I think one of Michael's slides suggests, that irrespective of whether the person is here as an immigrant or not, immigration cuts across all generations, and it reflects both in policy preferences. Clearly, in terms of preference for policy, legalization and normalization of status cuts across all Latinos in terms of irrespective of generation. I suspect other characteristics. Also, we had a number of policy questions dealing. One referred to the DREAM Act. That is, in fact, in Arizona, we just passed. I didn't vote for it, but we passed a policy that limits access to higher education for undocumented citizens in terms of having to pay out-of-state tuition, limit access. Those also, our questions indicate that Latinos do not, in general, do not support those types of policies. So there are some policy that cuts across. We've just now started at the policy aspect, but we deal with school vouchers, equalization, bilingual education, both use of the matricula for identification, high degree of support among Latinos for that avenue. So we're starting to see that there is some essentially, is there Latino policy issues that partly serve to mobilize and unite this community? And there's some early evidence that there are some, and we haven't sorted through beyond that.
In a particular area, I think your question was whether or not we had information that suggested that there were commonalities with Latinos and other groups. Wasn't that your question? We have a whole battery of questions on education, which we haven't really been able to get into, except for we do have our top lines available on our website if you want to look at that. But we haven't done education on it. But that would be the area where at least the preliminary looks at it suggests there is great commonality in those concerns with jobs, with education. Yes.
Can we take some additional questions? All the way in the back. Yes.
Thanks. That was actually a perfect segue to my question, both of these. And again, in terms of the level of depth that you're providing, I think it's very, very important and very timely, because a lot of polls tend to try to manipulate or twist answers to certain questions. So in the spirit of adding more knowledge to the pool that you are building here, I just wanted to also let people know that my name is Clarissa Martinez with NCLR. NCLR is putting out top lines for a national poll of Latino voters later this week that will have information going into 2006 election on Spanish speakers, 18 to 24 Latino voters, as well as a nationwide sample, which also tries to measure impact in relation to the marches. But in terms of twisting what Latinos may answer, you might have seen an article in the Washington Times sort of attempting to manipulate what Latinos think about English. And we all know that that Latinos support learning English.
That's right.
What for some people means that for English to become the official language in terms of policy might be a little different. So if in the education questions that you answered, you have found any nuances or any information that might inform, yes, Latinos support learning English, does that mean closing the door and doing away with any information in other languages? That would be really important. And the other more specific questions on the media, on the language media, the use of media and in what language. I thought I heard in your presentation saying that there seemed to be an association in your presentation about the dominant language of people based on the media they listen or they see. And I know that a lot of Latinos who consider themselves English dominant actually watch media in Spanish. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering if you could clarify that a little bit further.
Well, we did ask a question of how important it was for you or your family to maintain the ability to speak Spanish. And 85% said yes. It's in our top line. We're going to use that one and look at that further.
Similarly, they asked you how important it is to learn English. It was like 93%.
It was 93% for English.
Which is consistent with most other surveys that nature, that type of question.
And the reason we ask them distinctly is to, in fact, inform the national discourse in a much more broad way.
That's right.
But too often on many issues we develop artificial separations because they're convenient for particular agendas. And one of the things we wanted to do is to demonstrate not just complexity, but how much complexity is there, and is there some logic to the complexity? In our focus groups, for example, especially our Spanish language focus groups, among the issues people always brought up was, we want to learn English. They very quickly also brought up, there aren't a lot of opportunities for adults to learn English. And waiting lists are long, and we know that this is absolutely, these are folks who are relatively recent immigrants, we know how important it is, we know how significant it is. We ask as well, do you expect your children to be able to maintain the language? We'll look at that data, very interesting data. But these things can be far more additive, if you will, than subtractive, and we think we have some opportunity to bring information to that discussion.
Two other quick pieces of information. One of the design of this survey is that we have some state-specific questions.
Yep.
That is, some questions were only asked in Iowa or Washington. Two are asked in Arizona, largely because there were two propositions in that state, one regarding access to services, not only to higher education, but also adult ed classes. The state overwhelmingly, like 72%, voted against access for immigrants to adult education classes. So the motivation is there, but the policy works against it. Secondly, there was another English-only amendment or proposition in Arizona as in other states. That passed something like 72%. Among our Latinos, this is not people voted, but in our survey in Arizona, who basically asked that same question, about a plurality, about 48% of the 48% of the respondents would say they favor the English amendment. The question is, one is 20-some-odd points less than the overall, and secondly, it gets back to Luis's point, the complexity of why a Latino would vote for English-only amendment may be very different than someone else. Reason for that. So the complexity, I think, is hopefully what we can enlighten to a greater degree.
Okay. Again, all the way in back, the lady back there.
Hi, good morning. It's Susan Anton from USCIS, Office of Citizenship. First of all, I wanted to thank you for the inclusion of some of the gendered analysis in your research, because that's something that's I find lacking, especially in the areas of labor participation. My question was, in your research, in the different variables that you used to break down, was there any breakdown of urban versus rural in your research? And if so, how would that affect questions of assimilation, specifically with remittances, home ties, and political participation?
We haven't looked at that yet.
But we have the ability.
All of our respondents are geocoded.
Okay,
so we will be able to identify the census block and census tract within which they live. Part of our sampling design was one that distinguished between urban and rural populations in certain states to make sure that we got appropriate distribution. What happens sometimes in both statewide and national polls, is that you only get folks from where there are higher concentrations because your hit rate is higher. The sampling design that was developed for us was very careful and fully responsive to requests we made to try to disentangle the nature of the residential and related geographical complexity that Latinos live in. So we'll be able to do a lot.
Two other clarifications. The sample is weighted. There's three sets of weight. One of those weights is a metro, non-metro weight.
Okay.
So we can make that distinction. Secondly, you raise the issue about gender. Beside disaggregating the data by gender for a variety of different responses, there are specific battery questions. I think there are 4 of them that are sort of more gender-related issues, having to do with equal pay, having to do with women leadership roles, access to birth control, so that we can also plan to come up with indices of sort of gender attitudes to incorporate in our analysis. So you're seeing it, we're just sort of the tip of the iceberg in terms of what's possible with this particular study.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Right in the middle there. Yes.
Yes.
I'm sorry. Good morning. My name is Pamela Anderson from Catholic Relief Services, and let me also say to congratulate you on doing this tremendous work. I was wondering about the slides that talked about the connection over time with the countries of origin.
Yes.
What about the issue of the connection with religion? I know we talked about what it is to be an American and the effect of the perception of Christianity, but what about Catholicism?
Yeah.
Do they maintain that connection to the religion?
I'm sorry?
We'll know.
We will know. We have the ability. We haven't had a chance to look at that.
In general, about 2/3 of the respondents consider themselves Catholic. About 1/3 consider themselves something else. We will be able to track changes over time by year in the U.S., by generation, and shifts on religion and religious identification. The general literature suggests that there is a shift in identification over time, and the longer people remain in the U.S., the more likely they are to become actually largely Protestant and largely Pentecostal, born again. So there is a shift that takes place.
We have 2 other questions on religion beside religious affiliation. One is, do you consider yourself to be a born-again, spirit-filled Christian or involved with the charismatic movement? And secondly is also religious attendance. How often do you attend religious services?
We'll be able
so those are additional dimensions beside affiliation that are possible.
I believe this gentleman here. I'm sorry.
Right there.
Right here.
With the brown tie? Okay.
Yes.
I was particularly interested, Jack Martin, Federation for American Immigration Reform. I was particularly interested in the questions with regard to most important issue for Latinos and problems facing Latinos. It wasn't clear whether those were open-ended questions or if that was a menu of issues that were given, but looking at the percentages with regard to the most important issues, they added to about 70%. With regard to the problems facing Latinos, they added to about 60%. So the question is, where are the other 30% or 40%? Were those in identifying other issues, or are those people who are saying none of the above or no answer? And,
it was an open-ended question, and it was coded by our survey company. We're going through that coding. We're particularly going through, John is going through, I should be honest. John, with his research team, are going through those that were coded by our survey research firm as other, to see whether, in fact, they should have been initially coded into some of the traditional categories. So what I can tell you about relative to the data that we presented here is that there are others. The percentages are extremely small in terms of what they identify. That's why I tried to present to you what was most significant and most interesting. We'll readjust those as we recode the initially coded other responses and see what the patterns are. Now, I didn't tell you for those who said immigration was most important as to what their position was regarding immigration policy. Elements of the slide that Michael presented. We'll be able to do that. We haven't done that yet. Is there a consistency? Is there not? Does it vary by state? Does it vary by whether you identify as a Democrat or a Republican? Or is it 4th generation, 3rd generation, 2nd? We'll be able to have that sort of sophisticated understanding. of what the basis is for the particular positions that are presented. But it was open-ended, and we argued a lot about whether to do it in an open-ended fashion. For those of you who do surveys, you know it takes time and more money. But we thought it important, when we're forcing them to make a choice as to what was most important, that we learn from them what they thought was most important, and that's how we developed the responses to that
preliminary pattern
question.
is that probably about a fourth of the other responses fall into these what we anticipated responses, but the other ones are I mean, we're getting some very hard responses to categorize. In terms, life is crazy. You get some sort of aesthetic, philosophical responses. I mean, we get a whole battery of things. But we do have, I think, about 4 or 5 identifiable categories that we'll add to what the existing is. But when you do open-ended, you get some very interesting responses from people, in whatever the question may be.
Esoteric responses was probably going to be very highly correlated with graduate education, particularly in the humanities. No, just joking. So, but we have a sizable enough sample to be able to see whether or not there's any relationship in that.
Val, would you like to take that question on race?
Well, the question from, I think it's Liliana Martinez, was, can you speculate on the way the majority of Latinos did not identify themselves with the black race? Anything to say about views Latinos have of race, especially of associating themselves with their African origins? Any relationship? Well, unfortunately, we don't know anything about their African origins to suggest that. That I guess it was only about 1%, a little bit less than 1%, identified as black.
Right.
Racially.
Right.
Okay. So there are some limits.
It's very limited. I'm sorry to say on that one.
But the race question has been one of the popular discussion among both academics and non-academics in
For a
terms
long
of
time,
the intersection of race and ethnicity. And part of the reason we had questions in there was to try to hopefully enlighten not ourselves and others about that dynamic.
Right.
But it's a complex set, and I think.
Yeah, and we're still exploring, like I said, the determinants of racial identity, and of course, obviously, the correlation between racial identity and skin tone is important. So.
We had many, many long discussions about these questions as a group.
We almost didn't have those questions, the skin tone questions.
Gentlemen, yes.
Hello, Mitch O'Killian from George Washington Political Science Department, PhD candidate. You had some slides earlier that indicated the partisanship affecting political attitudes of Latino Americans, and while this may, I guess, require a little bit of speculation since you only surveyed Latino Americans, does partisanship seem to have a larger or smaller effect on political attitudes for Latino Americans than, say, white Americans or black Americans? Or really, how is the role of partisanship for Latino Americans different from white and black Americans?
Yeah, we'll be able to look at that.
Yeah.
And we'll be able to, in a way that relatively few surveys have been able to do. A few have. I think some of the Pew surveys are certainly large enough, and some have done that analysis, and Pew has done some of that analysis, to allow us to be able to gauge whether the patterns of partisanship or the underlying value structure or other structures that may most determine a partisanship for Latinos are distinct relative to what other researchers have found from other data sets at other periods of time. So you've got comparability issues, right? If we had more money, we would have surveyed everybody. Each one of you would have gotten a survey, right? Well, that's not possible, so you make certain choices. But that certainly is an important question that we think we can contribute to. The state design is also going to allow us to determine whether there might be not just variations by Latinos versus whites versus blacks, if we use other data, but for Latinos, are there variations by state? Are there variations by gender? Are there variations by generation in exactly the sorts of patterns that you're identifying?
Yes. The lady in back. Yeah.
Thank you. I just wanted to say thank you to all of you for your hard work. I'm Connie McGuire from the Washington Office on Latin America. And I had a question about your respondents. If you asked any questions of your respondents about their opinions about U.S. foreign policy towards the region in Latin America specifically, thinking about questions like free trade, Plan Colombia, That's one question. Another question is, I'm specifically looking at issues of violence in Latino transnational violence, looking at gangs. And so I'm wondering if your survey touched at all on violence in the U.S. or violence from the countries.
We don't ask foreign policy questions, although we do ask a question of Cubans about essentially regime change in Cuba.
There are three questions. One is, do you favor or oppose reestablishing diplomatic relations with Cuba? If Cuba were to change a democratic form of government, would you return to Cuba? And what do you think about the federal policy regarding limitation of travel and remittances? Those are the only specific foreign policy.
On violence, we have a couple of questions on crime and experiences of crime, identification of the perpetrator, that might lend itself to the kind of questions you'd like to see answered, but not particularly about. Well, I mean, you could distinguish it by generation, by time in the U.S., and so there might be some interesting patterns there.
Why is it just Cuba on the foreign policy? Why not any of the other U.S. policies towards Latinos?
Go ahead.
Sorry, we have very, very tight restrictions on the amount of time that we had with these respondents and the numbers of questions we could ask.
And this has been a long stand. I mean, this particular dimension has been a long. There's a long body of work dealing with these issues, and so it's sort of part of that bias, in a sense, of perpetuating that.
We're fully prepared to administer subsequent surveys with geoscapes. Any of you have checkbooks with you or contacts? I mean, part of the reason that we decided to focus exclusively on Latinos was to provide a rich enough database for all of us to generate more research on these topics and be able to make evidence-based arguments to foundations that it makes sense to continue to fund this type of research in other specific areas, or to continue to fund certain aspects of what we've done on a continued basis. Whether we do it or other people do it, it doesn't matter, but that the work get done to better inform the debate.
So we're almost at the witching hour. So why don't we take, say, 2 or 3 questions. This gentleman here, the 2 ladies over on the side there, or 3 ladies on the side there. So let's just, if you could just, very brief questions, ask them, and we'll try and answer them as a group here instead of taking them one by one.
Thank you very much. My name is Veronica Friel, and I'm with the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. We are the HHS agency mandated by Congress to produce a National Health Disparity and Quality Report each year. First, I'd like to ask Professor Garcia, in reference to some statements you made about news, Latinos getting news from about national news. Are you referring to English language sources like newspapers, radios, televisions, or are you referring also to Spanish language sources?
Well, the questions were formatted. How often you watch television news, and also often you read newspapers, and the follow-up question is, what's the primary language of that source, is the way we ask the questions.
And did most of them respond Spanish or English?
On that one, it was a plurality. No, it was not a majority in either language.
Right.
In fact, the response was. In fact, that's B. I know he's by number.
Yeah.
Guys, let's take the questions.
Okay.
And,
in reference to that, I was going to ask you, Dr. Jones-Correa, don't the charts that showed the natural increase, the birth rate of Latinos in the United States skyrocketing, with the immigration rates remaining about steady, that implies a continuous influx of native-born speakers, Spanish language persons, who, wouldn't you agree that that would help keep the Spanish language, Latino population speaking Spanish, vitalized, so that the importance of Spanish would continue, so that children would grow up speaking Spanish to serve what will be a third of the U.S. population. Spanish is going to continue to be, in my opinion, a very important language in this country. And the 4th generation people who say that they don't use Spanish, those are people who grew up and have lived their lives in a country that didn't have the current sizable Spanish population.
That's a good question.
Yes.
All right, so we're going to take this pool of questions, and then we'll try and bundle our responses.
Ana Sol Gutierrez, state legislator in Maryland, and I just want to say, wow, you have done a terrific job, especially for being able to have some factual basis for public policy. But at the same time, I want you to know you're going to give me a headache because the focus, obviously, is so valuable for us to understand the Latino community. But do you have any plans, or do you know of others who have plans of putting this into the context within other immigration experiences? Because what I find is that with Hispanophobia, with all of this anti-Hispanic, it's as if this study, could simply exacerbate those feelings by saying, look, they're unique. And I think a lot of your findings could be representative of other past immigration groups, and especially because you've gone through to the fourth generation. Could you comment on that, or how am I going to defend myself?
Okay, thank you. There should be one more.
Hi, my name is Nai, and I'm with GW. And I guess my question was probably going to be more directed to Miss Valerie. It was in regards to one of the things that happens, and I'm curious that if your study saw this, is strategic identifications amongst Latino people at certain points. I can't speak to all groups, but I know in particular in regards to Puerto Ricans, how over time there are fluctuations in people identifying themselves as either white or black, and how that seems to change and fluctuate at certain periods in history. And I think, it's very, very strategic, and I want to know how your study approaches that. And, does it account for some of what are these responding to and that kind of stuff? I guess that's about it.
Great. And finally, the last question. And then if the panel, we could just go down the row, and if we want to answer some aspect of these questions, and then.
Hi, my name is Pedro Reyes. I'm immigration counselor in Fern. My question is, I'm wondering if the educational background or the educational level was considered by the respondents, and how this impact the answers.
Okay. Rodney, do you want to start?
What's the first question?
Remind me of the question.
Just
take a question. Would you?
Anyone you want to read?
Well, the question you posed, yes, we do have data on education, and that will be something that we look at. So we have educational background, income levels, and a whole variety of things regarding socioeconomic status, which is something that's very, very common in the study of politics and so on. So yes, we definitely have that. We haven't started looking at it yet systematically, but we expect it'll have important impacts in a variety of ways.
One other aspect of education, which most surveys do not have, which we incorporate, is also we ask the question of foreign-born, where did you complete your final education? So was that so is it U.S. partially, or is it I came to the United States and my education was done? So we have that added dimension, which most other surveys don't have. On the question of language and media, 45.9% of the respondents indicated that they rely on Spanish language media for information about public affairs and politics. 30% English, 24% both equally. On the question of language retention, there's social linguists that argue that for non-English speaking populations in the United States, it takes a little over a generation for loss of that native language facility. There's been studies specific to Latinos. That process occurs for Latinos as well. It just takes longer. It's more like about a generation and a half. And obviously, continuous immigration helps extend that language retention as a major contributor. Anna's comment about the immigrant experiences, my suspicion is that there are some commonalities, but I suspect there's also some variations. That is, for instance, there's a significant Russian immigrant population in New York City. And my suspicion is that there may be some commonality, but there's some distinctiveness, whether it's by country of origin, whether it's by region, whether it's by race, that affects that immigration experience. And obviously, intellectually, it's a very interesting comparative sense that's worth challenging. And the final thing on the Puerto Rican racial identification. I'm going back to the contextual data because there's a lot of literature to argue that identification, whether it be ethnic or racial, is also situationally driven, and that a person may identify him or herself largely in the context in which they find themselves, either in terms of geography, composition of their workplace, and so forth. So our contextual data will also be useful to look at how much the context affects the racial identification that an individual responds to or identifies with.
I think I just want to second the comments about language retention. That all the research seems to show that language transition to English occurs fairly rapidly for all immigrant groups and also for Latinos, and that's true even with continuing immigration. It does not mean that Spanish will disappear. Clearly, with immigration, and then even in the second generation, there's a lot of dual use of Spanish and English media, but these dual users are not going to be native speakers, or they're not going to have the same facility with Spanish as they do with English. They're not going to have the training in grammar and literacy that they do in Spanish as they do in English, particularly in the second generation. So that generational shift in language use occurs, even though there'll be some persistence of Spanish in the second generation and beyond.
I'll venture a comment on the question regarding how folks are going to react to the data and how to think strategically about positioning oneself to be able to say, you see, this group isn't that different, or other groups have had similar experiences. One way to think of it is that I think we've generated on issues of identification, on issues of attitudes towards language, on issues of expectations of citizenship, body of data that is completely, that can help better inform much of the vitriolic discourse that too often characterizes what's there. But Mexico and Central America are close to the United States. Italy and Ireland were far away. And the patterns are different. So the historical comparisons are interesting. You know, the economies were at a different time. The role of multinational corporations were at a different time. So there are some uniquenesses. You know, the vulnerability, one could argue, the vulnerability of the working class in the United States, whatever their ethnic background, is higher now, certainly, than it was at the turn of the century in the middle of the Industrial Revolution. It's a different reality. I think we have to acknowledge important elements of those differences if we're not just going to try to structure the debate, but try to make the debate maybe a little bit more informed, if not, hopefully, a little smarter than it's been before, and provide some guidance to those with the hard work of structuring public discourse, right? That's not our hard work. That's many of your hard work. Advocates, whatever your positions, public officials and so forth, to give you more reason to maybe think differently than before and see where one might identify opportunities for building those coalitions that are so rare these days in so much of our politics.
And on that note, I think we should close. I wanted to thank you for your patience. And we look forward to many continuing conversations with all of you here in this room.
Thank you very much. Great job.
Yeah. I was hoping you were the one that had all the state papers.
Right, yeah.
My largest paper is the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.
We all right.
And so I was wondering if you could tell me anything about Georgia. I know that in
Well,
a couple of the flyers they had kind of a distinctive...
Yeah, basically, this is going to be on the website.
Okay, okay.
So this is Georgia as a whole. Okay. You know, this is not Atlanta only.
Right, the whole state.
Okay, but basically, here's a question about, in common with African Americans in general, and we actually asked a question, there were 4 choices, but for these purposes I collapsed them. Okay, but this is what you find, 40, well, and then you got this, and then...
This is the highest, I guess I was intrigued that they had the highest number.
Of saying nothing a little, no, slightly.
Did you get the executive maybe it wasn't that.
Yeah,
Okay,
it's
one
not,
of the questions
yeah,
where they said they were
yeah, there's one where Georgia does stand out. Politically in common with African Americans, 44% versus 40, that's pretty close. I think it's a competition question. Since competition is... No, but there is one. But remember, you know, when you think about higher low, think of Georgia as one of the newer
states. Let me ask you a little bit about the newer emerging states, because I have been doing a version for Georgia. We have all this good Georgia information.
Which is...